Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Case, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is a very, very special episode. I say that all the time because they all are very special, but this one is especially special. I have with me Dr. Greg Welty, and we're going to be talking about his new book, Alvin Plantinga, which is in the Great Thinkers series for Presbyterian and Reformed, P&R Publishing. And I've had a lot of these authors from the Great Thinker series on. They're great books. I love them. I've enjoyed all the ones that I had so far. This one's no different. It's fantastic. It might be a little bit longer than the other ones in the series, but it's like 150 pages on Alvin Plantinga, and it's like tight and concise and really, really rich. So stay tuned, you guys. We're gonna be mostly focused on the problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. But we'll see where the conversation goes, as you guys know, who are regular listeners. Before we jump in, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast happen over on Patreon. If you guys like this podcast, please consider supporting me. There, you can find the link in the description. Help keep the lights on, help feed my dog Theophilus. And if you guys don't like Patreon for some reason, you can also support me here on YouTube if you're watching there through the YouTube members program. So you can find that link somewhere down here. YouTube members. That would be huge. All right. Well, let's stop commodifying ourselves and jump in with Dr. Greg Welty to talk about Alvin Plantinga. Dr. Welty, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Sure, no problem. It's really good to be here. I'm glad this is an extra special episode. Sort of sounds like maybe an after school special. You don't want to miss. But
That's right.
but good. I know it's taken a while to get me on here, so
Yeah, that's right.
all due to
Yeah, this
me.
is awesome. Well, yeah, and so I mentioned this off air, but I just wanted to start with a quick thank you because I emailed you and James Anderson a few years back, and I don't expect you guys to recall that or anything. A bunch of people emailing you, but I said, hey, I want to be like you guys. I want to be a Calvinistic philosopher. I want to be top notch. And both of you gave me very similar advice, saying, hey, why don't you go learn some theology before you jump into philosophy, and see if you still want to. And so I got 2 master's degrees from TEDS in systematic theology and theological studies, and now I'm working on philosophy of religion. And Lord willing, I'll continue on into philosophy. But both of you, God has used in my life to set the trajectory of my life. So that's pretty wild. Thank you for that.
No, no problem. I think I remember giving you this lengthy list of sources and saying, well,
Yeah.
some Christian philosophers is at least possible to defend a version of Christianity that's not worth defending. So you might want to,
Right.
if God gives you time and opportunity to learn things like biblical languages, church history, principles of
Hmm.
exegesis, so that you avoid thinking, I don't know, Neo-Apollinarianism on the incarnation is, really a great thing or something like that, right? At least know what the
Right.
options are and be able to approach your philosophical studies with that in the background. So, it's great if
Totally.
you can get that. So I'm glad that was of use.
Yeah, totally. Well, before we jump into Alvin Plantinga, who is a Christian philosopher in his own right, a bunch of things we can characterize him in a bunch of different ways, and we will. I want to just ask about Plantinga's definition of philosophy and maybe your definition of philosophy. Many people will know in the audience that Plantinga says philosophy is thinking hard about something. I just wanted to get your take. What do you make of that definition? And then how would you define philosophy yourself?
Right. I don't know if I quote that particular definition in the book. I think I have, heard it. I mean, it's notoriously difficult to define the discipline. So at one level, thinking really hard or thinking about thinking
Hmm.
might strike many people as just a good as an attempt as any other. There is the always definition by example. You just sort of point at these very subdisciplines or journals and say, do what they do, enter
Right.
the conversation, we're done. I don't really know. I mean, etymologically, of course, love of wisdom is always there, but that just invites a lot of further questions. In most of the
Right.
syllabi for my classes here at Southeastern, I have like a fundamental definition of philosophy that then I adapt for the different syllabi, so I don't have to keep on reinventing the wheel.
Right.
But it includes everything that I just sort of want to communicate to the students. So it's something like philosophy is articulating and evaluating arguments, pro and con, for the truth and coherence of fundamental claims. Now, there's a
Hmm.
lot packed in there, like J.I. Packer, packing in all the words. But
That's
but
right.
each part of that is important. So you're both articulating arguments of your own. All right. You then
Hmm.
are evaluating arguments of others. These are arguments that are either for or against the truth of fundamental claims, or sometimes the coherence of fundamental claims. And
Hmm.
so I'm really big on the idea that the lifeblood of philosophy is arguments, right? If you're just studying
Okay.
post-it notes, summaries, Reader's Digest summaries of positions, but have no idea why the thinker arrived at that position, you're doing you're doing history philosophy, not really philosophy, right? So
Yeah.
apologies to Anthony Kenny, who's a great philosopher in his own right, but history of philosophy is not, it's not philosophy. So this
Mhm.
is what we do over and over in class, is articulate and evaluate arguments. And then the other part of that is the truth and coherence of fundamental claims, right?
Mhm.
And maybe there's one thing to wonder: is this claim true? If so, what reason do we have to think it's true? It's another claim to ask. Another thing to ask: is it even possible for this claim to be true? Is it intelligible? And philosophers think about
Right.
both of these matters. Finally, in like fundamental, these are fundamental claims. So fundamentals relative to discipline. So maybe there's fundamental claims taken for granted in science. So then there's philosophy of science. If you're talking about a different domain, knowledge, you get epistemology. Another domain, being, you get metaphysics, and so on. So that might be a way to at least give a synopsis of the kind of activities that we do under philosophy.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. I'm reminded of you quoting Plantinga here in the book about his time at Yale, where he seemed like a lot of the students and some of the professors they would rehearse different arguments and the history, maybe the history of philosophy, but he was lamenting that he wasn't learning how to do philosophy. He wasn't being taught to actually do it himself, at least partially there. And I think of that with myself. And I'm really glad to be at Palm Beach,
Mhm.
Atlantic, where we're learning to do philosophy ourselves. So that's really fun. When you think about Christian philosophy, um, is I think of Kant's "What is Enlightenment," and he talks about nonage, and he talks about dare to use your own reason and not be confessional. Can you help us out? Like, is there anything off limits for a confessional philosopher when it comes to analyzing and scrutinizing beliefs?
Um, well, I mean, at one level, I'm going to say no. I mean, we should be
Okay.
interested in examining, right, arguments for and against the truth and coherence of our distinctive Christian claims wherever and whenever we find them, right? So I guess
Yeah.
broadly speaking, I take on board kind of perspective of Thomas Aquinas, right, who
Mm.
examines so many different kinds of arguments for Christian claims as well as against Christian claims, and he has a kind of faith, right, that if there are arguments, for instance, opposed to our views, then either somewhere the argument has gone wrong, right? There's a
Mhm.
position argument that's gone wrong, or maybe they've misunderstood what we as Christians mean by the terms we use. So it's a kind of opportunity for us to clarify further what we mean, right? So I'm
Yeah.
not saying that Aquinas's view is Plantinga's view. Plantinga's view seems to be, as I bring out in the chapter on methodology, right, that we can just sort of unabashedly in our arguments themselves sort of just start with Christian convictions, right, and not
Yeah.
have to give a lengthy prolegomena on behalf of those. So I mean, that's Plantinga
Right.
working out what he sees as implications from his Dutch Reformed heritage there on topics pertaining to education and philosophy. But I just tend to say in class, yeah, Christian philosophy is studying the realms of truth, being, and value uh, from a Christian, perspective, right? So
Yeah.
take on board any insights you have from the scriptures. At the very least, the scriptures have veto power over various conclusions we might reach.
Yeah.
But you definitely, I think, no arguments should be off limits, right? As
Okay.
somehow intrinsically corrosive of our faith, right? God's able to make the wrath of
Right.
man praise him. So I think all of these arguments, even those against us, can be for the greater good. So,
Yeah.
real generic pious approach to the
That's
entire thing, completely
no, that's
fallible.
really good. I think some people worry, if you hold to the Westminster or the 1689, and there's stuff about simplicity in there, then it's like, well, I can't, I've signed on to this document, so I can't scrutinize that position of God's divine simplicity. I've affirmed it, but like you're saying, no, and there's nothing off limits. You can still scrutinize, you can still reason through, and hopefully, defend that doctrine of simplicity, for instance.
Yeah, I remember, sorry to jump in. I'm remembering an exchange. This happened a long time ago, like around the year 2000. It was at the Gifford Bequest conference. It was in Aberdeen, Scotland, and I think Robert Koons was there. He was given a very complicated version of the cosmological argument. I think
Hmm.
Evan Fales, right, a noted atheist, was there as well. I'm hope I'm not misattributing the comment, but I remember Evan Fales saying, "Well, it's all great that you're really into Aquinas and all the rest, but there's no way that he can actually be a philosopher, and it's
Yeah.
because to be a philosopher, you have to have a kind of neutrality."
Right.
And all of Aquinas's conclusions in the big areas, right? They're not up for grabs. They're already pre-selected for him by the church or whatever relevant authorities he trusts, apart from reason, and that sort of disqualifies him at the outset from being a philosopher. Now, I remember Kuhn sort of pushing back,
Yeah.
against that, and of course, someone like Plantinga would as well. That your prior convictions, you should just be honest about them and state them, and
Yeah.
then pursue your philosophy in the midst of it. Plantinga is big on
Yeah.
conditionalization, right? If
Hmm.
this if this Christian doctrine were the case, I'm not saying I have good arguments that it is, but if it were the case, here's how it would affect how we formulate, such and such,
Yeah.
and that can be useful. And he even cites secular philosophers who are doing pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
Scott Atran on kind of socio biology when it comes to religion. Um, I'm not rendering a judgment as to religious beliefs are true or false, but from this strictly speaking scientific point of view, purely empirical, here's the best explanation. And Plantinga says I have no problem with that. So
Yeah.
conditionalization might actually help various sides to have a more robust discussion in the midst of a lot of controversies about neutrality. So sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. No, no, please, man. This is awesome. This is why you're here. So good. Um, well, okay. So in the foreword is written by Bill Davis, a student of Plantinga, and he makes this insightful point that there are Christian philosophers who are meant to speak to fellow Christians,
Mhm.
and then there are Christian philosophers who are meant to speak to fellow philosophers. And I love this point, and this is something you mentioned in the notes you sent that you kind of picked up from your study in writing this book.
Mhm.
Can you help us flesh that out a little bit more, and then maybe give some examples of people from each category?
Yeah, so I think what he's talking about are Christian philosophers, but then it's not so much an absolute contrast, but a kind of relative contrast in callings, right? A kind of difference of
Yeah.
emphasis. This is based on the individuals, maybe their gifts, their environment, their opportunities at the time. So they're Christian philosophers, but then are they largely called to speak to fellow Christians about philosophy? Right. Maybe like
Mm.
Christians as a group are like completely clueless about this. And why is this important? And what's going on in philosophy? Is it a threat? Is it a help? And so you can be a Christian philosopher who is a kind of interpreter of philosophy to your fellow Christians. And I think some of the
Yeah.
people he names there are like Francis Schaeffer and Gordon Clark, Cornelius Van Til, John Frame, right?
Mm.
Largely, though not exclusively, largely their audience is other Christians, right? And they're writing to really help their fellow Christians in church to think about this matter of philosophy. So those would be Christian philosophers who are largely, not exclusively, largely called to speak to fellow Christians about philosophy. But then I
Mhm.
think Davis talks about another kind of emphasis, and that is you're called to speak to other philosophers about Christianity. And I mean, I'm sort of reticent to use this word, but it's a bit more maybe evangelistic in that sort of the audience for which you're writing, right, is largely secular publishers. You're entering into that discussion very robustly. Again, this contrast is relative, not absolute, right?
Right.
Um, and so they're speaking to fellow philosophers about Christianity and bringing out maybe implications, right? Which is why
Mhm.
what's really unique about Plantinga is that he rises to prominence in the 1960s, and from there on out, he is actually drawing upon themes in Augustine and Anselm and Boethius, right? And
Yeah.
Molina, Calvin, Edwards, Luther, Bavinck, right? This is like unheard of for like a Christian philosopher to do that. But again, the audience is so often just like secular journals in philosophy, secular presses, 1967, Cornell University Press, Got Another Mind, stuff like that, that really put them on the map.
Yeah.
And so sort of, at least some secular philosophers sort of give notice, right? They take notice of
Yeah.
this, that he's addressing them and he's analyzing arguments they're interested in
Yeah.
as secularists. So maybe this would include Plantinga. The second category, maybe Swinburne, maybe the Adams family, which is what we call them at UCLA, right? Bob and Marilyn Adams.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe William Alston. There do seem to be some philosophers who are like right split down the middle, right? And maybe I think
Mm,
of like Paul Helm like this, right? Like Paul Helm,
okay.
monograph on the timelessness of God. Right. But then, he has a lot of really practical, helpful work for fellow Christians, right?
Yeah.
So that's pretty much, I think, the distinction that Bill Davis is getting at there.
Yeah. I love that distinction. I think it can be helpful, for even just thinking about different thinkers. And when you're reading a book, is this for other Christians, or is this for and that'll help you evaluate uh, how successful the book is, and if you are writing a book, it can help you even just being mindful of your audience is always going to be helpful in,
Mm,
in knowing how to write
mm.
and what to write. So I really appreciated that distinction. Most of my audience is going to know who Alvin Plantinga is, but I thought if we just give like a brief characterization, like who is this guy, that a book would be written about him in the Great Thinker series.
Right. Yes. That's really chapter one. By the way, if you go to the P&R site for the book, they give you like the preface forward in chapter one for free, so you can like
Oh wow.
download that. And chapter one is mainly just autobiographical, in that Plantinga himself has written a couple very lengthy pieces, self-profile and a Christian life partly lived, right? That I try to condense and sort of bring out the points about his life and his upbringing, convictions, and then I try to adjudicate, right, this matter of does he deserve to be a great thinker, right? You ask Plantinga, he might say, oh, I don't have any great, spiritual experiences. I'm just like every other regular Christian. I mean, I quote him to that effect. But I mean, real briefly then. So, he was born in 1932. So I think he celebrated his 90th birthday last year. I sent him a card.
Hmm.
Um, let's see. Has a kind of like Dutch Reformed upbringing, right? So that will mean something maybe to some of your listeners in terms of the three forms of unity,
Yeah.
right? The Heidelberg Catechism, Belgian Confession, Canons of Dort, right?
Yeah.
Him being catechized, right? And just hearing sermons and things like that really did have an influence on him. It affected his view of education as not religiously neutral, because that's part of that tradition. It affected his view of
Yeah.
philosophy, which he largely got from a mentor at Calvin College, where he got his
The
bachelor's.
Chelema.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That philosophy is at bottom a kind of rivalry between fundamental religious alternatives, right?
Yeah.
In fact, 30 years before Plantinga was at Calvin College, I mean, Cornelius Van Til is a student there. When Plantinga's there,
Right.
people like Nicholas Wolterstorff are his classmates. But real briefly then, Dutch Reformed upbringing, goes to Calvin College, then he gets an MA at University of Michigan, then he goes on and gets his PhD at Yale. Then his first teaching gig is at Wayne State University for about 5 years. You mentioned earlier about, just learning how to do philosophy. Plantinga felt like he really
Yeah.
learned to do philosophy at Wayne State because of just this camaraderie among his colleagues. And
Yeah.
he's like, once in a while we did lectures, um, but really we just debated philosophy. But like one of his colleagues was Edmund Gettier, like Gettier
I know,
cases,
it's
right?
crazy.
Hector
Yeah.
Castaneda, all these Keebler. Um,
I think Yandel might have been there too. Do you know?
I'm
I
not
believe he
sure.
was.
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not
I think they
sure.
were colleagues. Yeah.
I almost had Yandel as my supervisor at the PhD level, but I decided to
Oh,
go
wow.
overseas. But yeah, so we um went back and forth a little bit. But anyway, Wayne State, then about 20 years teaching at Calvin College, then about maybe 30 years at University of Notre Dame, right? So I mean, we're talking a
Mhm.
teaching career that spans over 50 years, right? So
Yeah.
the way I summarize in the book is quantity and quality in terms of his
Mm.
output, why I think that he's like a great thinker, right? So, like quantity, think about somebody who writes on average 3 peer-reviewed articles in philosophy a year for 60 years, right?
Yeah.
Just do the math, right? Like
Yeah.
that's just enormous, right? This isn't like
Right.
my blog posts or something, right? Um, so 20, 14, books, right? Written all the monographs and books that are about him. I think I count like 21, 22 books
Yeah.
over a 30-year period, written about him. I mean, I don't have a single book written about me, right? Rightly
Mhm.
so. Imagine if you have
Not
20.
not yet. It might be coming.
Yeah,
Yeah, it might be coming down the line.
maybe in the next life. But imagine, all of these books. So many doctoral dissertations. My own dissertation at Oxford is a kind of blow up 300-page long of like a paragraph in 2 dozen or so arguments for the existence of God in some unpublished lecture by Plantinga, right?
Wow.
James
Yeah.
Anderson, right? It's all about Plantinga's epistemology, and
Yeah.
on it goes. So there's the quantity of the work, the quality of the work. I think I've already mentioned, right? All of the different Christian philosophers that he and thinkers he thought he took to be relevant to doing philosophy, even in a secular realm, right?
Mhm.
Sightings of these Christian thinkers were relatively rare prior to Plantinga's career, like in actual journals, except for
Mhm.
maybe Roman Catholic journals of philosophy, right? They're sort of,
Right.
faithfully preserving, right, a lot of what's good in the Christian tradition. But outside of that, I mean, you're not going to find it in mainstream
Yeah.
secular journals. But things have sort of changed, and so I think he deserves to be a candidate for a great thinker because of his influence on a whole, the discussion, maybe philosophical practice, particularly among Christians who maybe are a bit bolder in being open about what their convictions are and what they might imply. Plus,
Yeah.
finished with this. He's one of the few Christian philosophers who has really given a lot of thought to what does it mean to be a Christian philosopher,
Right.
as opposed to like just being a philosopher who happens to be a Christian. Like, what is that all
Mhm.
about? And what are the things that, if you want, like, what can Plantinga nerds learn about, Plantinga here? What struck me was how difficult that question was for him. I thought, well,
Yeah.
he's written about 5 or 6 pieces on method in Christian philosophy. It must have been really easy for him. But he says in his autobiographical pieces, this is one of the hardest things that I
Mm.
had to address for my own satisfaction is what does it mean to be a Christian philosopher instead of just a philosopher who happens to be a Christian. So I get into that in the
Mm.
chapter on method, because
Yeah.
he has 5 methodological principles and 4 activities, and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
I'll pause there, just to say that the book examines his thought and tries to give accessible summaries of his thought in 5 areas, right? So
Yeah.
faith and reason, problem of evil, theistic arguments, divine attributes, religion and science, and then maybe philosophical method, and then finally how he relates to the Reformed heritage, which is
Yeah.
especially relevant for Plantinga because, of course, unlike Dawkins or Kant or whatever, that actually is his tradition from which he's coming.
Yeah. Man, good memory. It's almost like you've been working on this for a while or something.
I
You
actually,
you got all the
I've been
all the
afraid
tip
of all these podcasts because I mean I wrote the book a year ago, right? Like I've in my
mm.
mind I've moved on completely to this other
Ah,
book on the problem of evil, right? This 40 questions on
yeah.
suffering and evil book that I'm trying to finish up. So it's sort of, I can't really use that as an excuse, right? I was at this APA session, William Lane Craig and Peter Van der Wagen, and they start asking Craig questions about his abstract objects book, right? Which is the whole reason we're here. And like the first thing out of his
Right.
mouth is, "Oh, well, actually, I've moved on to the atonement book, all the rest." I was like, "Hey, like this is what this thing's about." I mean, I'm sure he was just joking and breaking the ice. He was
Right.
versatile on any topic they asked him about. But
Totally.
yeah, that's I am trying to remember uh all the
Yeah.
stuff. I have flipped through the book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
that
good.
kind of thing.
I love that. So I want to get into some evil stuff, but first, you've got this really cool pedigree yourself at UCLA with the Adams family. You went to Westminster with Frame, and then Oxford with Swinburne, and then you sent me your dissertation, years and years ago, and I've been just like
Mm.
slavishly reading over it. I love that, but even seeing the people on your board is like insane. Davies and all these folks. Um, so I wanted to ask you, as someone who has studied under Swinburne and then wrote a book on Plantinga, to give a characterization. You do in the book a little bit as well, between the two. And I don't want to ask like the great question because that's kind of gross. Like who's the greatest of the Christians who are supposed to be humble? But can you characterize maybe their positions and the way that they do philosophy?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't find a lot of usefulness in like, who's the greatest kind of
Right.
kind of questions. I mean, what do you get out of that? What are you supposed to do after somebody gives you the case? Like, bow down, we're not worthy, we're not worthy.
I know, right? Yeah,
It might come
right,
across to some people that, I think Plantinga is like the fourth person of the Trinity and worthy of appropriate worship. I mean, nothing could be
right.
further from the truth, right? I mean, these individuals, whether it's Plantinga or Swinburne, I mean, they're not above us in the clouds. They're not like beneath us, right? To just stomp
Right.
on with impunity. They're by our sides, right? They help
Mhm.
us, and sort of thinking through some very difficult issues, right? I mean, there are
Yeah.
mysteries, and then there are mysteries, and Trinity, incarnation, atonement. I mean, we're saddled with a lot, right?
Yeah.
We need all the help that we can get. So I think we should view these individuals as allies.
Yeah.
Um, so the question was really like on how they. Oh well, yeah, adjudicating them. Yeah, it's funny. Random thought. Like was a year ago or relatively recently, like the philosopher of mind, Colin McGinn, actually
Mm.
wrote a blog post. You can look it up, and he
Yeah.
basically gives an argument. I'm the best philosopher living. And he makes like this objective case from all of his writings, and which I thought was funny. Um,
Yeah.
Maybe one thing that I let on in the book is number one, the great contrast between Plantinga and Swinburne, and how that was sort of bewildering to me. Right when I
Yeah.
went overseas to England in like about 1998 for those 5 years for the infill and DPhil. Plantinga had, I'm sure, risen to prominence in a kind of American context, and it was sort of a sense of bowing down. We're not worthy. We're not worthy. Oh, he's just so amazing. But like you go over there, and the Brits are having none of it. Um,
Yeah.
they're just like, this guy's has his head in platonic clouds. We're about ordinary language philosophy here. Are his arguments any good? They weren't gonna give anything to the arguments. So, well, before I mean, I think Plantinga and Swinburne are the two most influential Christian philosophers in the second half of the 20th century. Um,
Okay.
of course, the transformation of the scene, to the extent that that's happened, I think that can be overstated. There might even be a bit of a backlash against that assessment. Um,
Sure.
that nowadays, we ought not to be, really focusing on, how the culture perceives us, right? Just keep your head down and
Yeah.
do good work. And maybe though dead, maybe you will speak. um, uh,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. But yeah, there's a big contrast between them, right? And that was bewildering to me. So um, Swinburne's like an internalist when it comes to epistemology, like his book Epistemic Justification, Faith and Reason.
Right.
Plantinga is much more of an externalist. Swinburne thinks skeptical theism just isn't a great strategy when it comes to the problem of
Mhm.
evil. You can read his preface to his 1998 book, Providence and the Problem of Evil. He thinks it leads to moral skepticism, right?
Yeah.
It's not a price worth paying to do skeptical theism. Plantinga thinks skeptical theism is like the next best thing to sliced bread. He pursues it a lot in chapter 14 of War to Christian Belief and in other venues. Swinburne thinks cumulative case natural theology is just really awesome, souped up Bayesianism, this kind of thing. We can make a case existence of God is more likely than not. Plantinga is like, principal dwindling probabilities. I'm not sure you can get a lot, from that. Swinburne thinks that God's ignorance of the future is vast. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
quote from his book, The Christian God. So definitely not just an open theist, but the inspirer of open theists. The
Okay.
person whom Clark
Yeah.
Pinnock cites when Pinnock
It's a
wants
big
to
deal.
explain his open
Yeah.
theism. Plantinga has an undiminished, conception of divine foreknowledge. Swinburne thinks Molinism just can't work. Right, free will foreknowledge dilemma is also just pretty good. Pike's version of it. Plantinga thinks you can use Occam's way out. Plantinga thinks Molinism is great. Swinburne's like logically necessary existence of God, and he
I
kind
know,
of get
yeah.
so Plantinga was like, yeah, sure, maximal greatness. So
Right.
there's this like that was very bewildering for me because I was like, they both have like this Christian profession, right? What am I supposed to do? And this conflict sort of just taught me to be a philosopher, right?
Yeah.
You just have to examine this. And I'm very, this might disappoint some of your hearers. I'm very sketchy about non-eclectic approaches. I'm very sketchy
Okay.
about like, you have this entire system bequeathed to you by the master, and you can't tweak one little part of it because if you do, then you should be labeled as a compromiser and all the rest.
Right.
I just you need to study the arguments, let the chips fall where they may. And so,
Yeah.
you know, um, I'm not really answering your question. I guess because this is a long way
No,
of
I
avoiding,
think
right?
it's helpful.
They're doing different things, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Plantinga
Yeah.
doesn't attempt Swinburne's cumulative case, natural theology, right? He doesn't
Right.
have that kind of highly integrated trilogy in that area. He has another highly
Right.
integrated trilogy, right, in epistemology. So sometimes
Right.
different people are doing different things. And actually, I
Yeah.
think that's also what's going on with respect to like evidentialism and classical natural theology on the one hand, and transcendental arguments for God's existence on the other hand. My
Okay.
master metaphor here is like the trunk of the tree, right? And so
Mhm.
some thinkers are saying, hey, do you know that if you accept these things, you might have some really good reason to believe in God? You know, these fundamental principles of causality or sense experience or logic. There might be others who are saying, hey, you know, this trunk really needs roots, right? How do you account for this trunk, right?
Yeah.
Those aren't
Yeah.
contradictory approaches. They're just doing different things.
Yeah.
They're touching different parts of the tree as opposed to the elephant. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. That's better.
so,
Yeah. You
um,
can't use the element.
so I get
Yeah.
from frame a kind of, I guess I'm fundamentally a peacemaker. Maybe that means I'm a compromiser. I don't know. Um, but
Yeah. Depends on who you ask.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I'll stop babbling, but definitely a Swinburne
No.
Plantinga contrast. I think that's
Yeah.
entirely healthy and salutary
Right.
for Christian philosophy to have these
Yeah.
philosophers rise to prominence and bequeath the next generation with a lot of helpful thought that then we sort through. I mean, our justification doesn't depend upon this, right? We have a
Right.
kind of freedom to think things out, right? God's already met our
Yeah.
greatest need. Right?
Yeah.
So,
Amen. Amen. Well, and that's something I wanted to bring out as well. And I've had a similar experience when I was learning about these two. I just wanna follow somebody. Just tell me what to believe, and it's like, that's so anti, philosophical, but you can't do it because the 2 leading ones completely disagree on so much, and it's almost like God orchestrated that so that you couldn't just
mm,
follow one without
mm.
it's like, good luck because this guy exists and he completely disagrees and they both love God, so I
Yeah,
actually
that's
really appreciate
possible.
that.
I don't want to divine the purpose of God,
No, no, of course not. Yeah.
and all
Right,
of
right,
that,
right.
but definitely you can see how there's that kind of diversity. And Paul actually has a kind of argument in Corinthians for there must be
Mm,
differences among you to see who would have God's
yeah,
approval and all that kind of thing. I mean, there's a kind of divine wisdom, right?
yeah,
Um, and allowing this. So yeah,
yeah.
I think it's okay if it's a buzzing, blooming confusion to a certain degree.
Sure.
Um,
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, with that, let's get into some evil stuff. These are some arguments against God, and uh, I, you break it down into Plantinga and his responses to logical problems of evil, or the logical problem of evil, and evidential problem of evil, whether those are families or not, whatever. Most of my audience will know Plantinga's response to the logical problem of evil, so maybe we can just kind of like wave at that, and
mm,
then you go in. There's a lot of replies to the evidential
mm,
problem of evil, and I
mm.
thought those will be more. My audience will be less familiar with those. So maybe just can you broach Mackey's argument, and then it's just free will, right? So Plantinga uses the free will argument, but maybe we can just yeah, wave
Maybe.
at it as we go by. Yeah,
Maybe. So I actually I discovered a lot that I ought to have known. I mean, I've been teaching through this
mm,
material for a while, but sort of getting a bird's eye view of like the body of work that Plantinga has
yeah,
produced. I hadn't actually set it before me, so I hadn't discerned prior to the writing of the book that Plantinga gives at least 7 distinct replies to the problem of evil.
mhm,
Essentially, by my counting, 2 replies to the logical argument, and then 5 replies to the evidential argument. And it also surprised me that actually libertarian free will, either its possibility or its value or it's both, is only really required for 2 of those replies.
right,
Something similar with classical theism. I know you didn't ask about that, but Plantinga's on record as dissenting from some pieces of classical theism, like simplicity, immutability, timelessness, God being without passions. But he doesn't really do a lot with that. Um, and
yeah,
most of his arguments would go through with or without that. I mean, some might take that to be a bug, others a feature, but that's
right,
just it doesn't seem like his arguments depend on that. And so the vast majority of his arguments, actually in the realm of from of evil, don't really depend upon the actuality. or even the possibility of distinctively libertarian free will. It's just not essential to his arguments here. That's sort of maybe Christian culturally that's like the perception. I don't want to minimize, of course, his
Yeah.
actual commitment to libertarian free will. He thinks it's extraordinarily important. It's why his occasionalism is a kind of modified occasionalism, right? There's space for
Right.
us to agent cause our own intentions. God's not the only cause in the world, but he's more of a cause than you might think. That's occasionalism. So, Mackey's argument, of course, famous Oxford atheist, 1955 article on evil and omnipotence, right, claims that there's this logical contradiction between God and evil. They cannot coexist in the same world. It'd be like having an irresistible force and an immovable object in the same world.
Yeah.
There would be an inconceivable smash, right? Um, if
Mhm.
God has all power and all goodness, right, then there just won't be any evil because he would have eliminated it, and then of course he's able to. Um,
Yeah.
so there's a twofold response here. I find many people overlook the first response and focus on the second, right? The first
Yeah.
response is an undercutting defeater. Mackey just hasn't made his case. He needs
Mhm.
these quasi logical rules that expound for us what is implied by omnipotence, what is implied by perfect goodness. And Plantinga
Yeah.
thinks, particularly with the claim about what perfect goodness will do, it's not really up to snuff. It's really
Mhm.
hard to make these quasi-logical rules, these claims that Mackey needs, that a good thing would always eliminate evil as far as it can. Like that's just like automatically true. And
Right.
he shows that Mackey can't make the case. So, that's not a rebutting defeater. He's not disproving Mackey's conclusion. He's just saying Mackey didn't make a good case. Now,
Yeah.
what Plantinga is really known for is the free will defense. This is the second reply to the logical argument from evil in nature of necessity and God, freedom, and evil. And here he really is seeking to overturn Mackey's conclusion to prove it false. You say God and evil are contradictory. I say that they are consistent. And he
Yeah.
sort of wants to rule out all Mackey style arguments in advance, right? Because,
Right.
okay,
Yeah.
Mackey number one didn't give a good argument. Maybe Mackey number two or Schmacky or Wacky, give a different
Yeah.
version. I just want to
Right.
prove that these are compatible. So I suppose you're asking, like, in a nutshell, what Plantinga does is that he comes up with a model in which it can be clearly seen that God and evil are logically consistent. I think it's
Yeah.
Doug Guyvett who says in one of his pieces on Problem of Evil that the strength of Mackey's claim is its weakness, and that Mackey, in claiming that God and evil are logically contradictory, you're making a claim implicitly about all possible worlds. You're saying
Yeah.
God and evil do not coexist in any possible world. So to refute that, you just have to come up with one in which it's
Right.
clearly seen that they coexist. Now, whether Plantinga has done this, right, that's open for debate. But the way he does this is he says, well, there could be truths about how we would use our libertarian free will. And so God's omniscient. He's going to know these truths. It's at
Mhm.
least possible, since these truths are contingent, right? They're about libertarian
Yeah.
free will, right? That these truths reveal to God something. And that is for any possible person that it was available to God to create, that person would end up doing at least one bad thing in the course of their
Mhm.
life. They don't have to be a serial killer like Jeffrey Dahmer or something like that. They could just be,
Right.
I stole gum from the store or I had a bad thought about my mother. But, these truths reveal that every person available for God to create would go bad, would do at least one bad thing. So just imagine that's how the counterfactuals turn out, right? And
Sure.
maybe we could have a
Yeah.
separate thing on Molinism, right? But
Yeah.
let's say it turns out this way. Well, then God goes ahead and creates a world that ends up having moral good in it. Well, there's a price he pays for that. That's going to entail there's going to be like some moral evil. So God goes ahead and creates a world with moral good in it, right? That entails there's moral
Yeah.
evil. So now you have a kind of model, a situation in which there's God and evil. And he thinks this is all entirely compatible with God's attributes, right?
Yeah.
And all the rest. So I guess you said you didn't want to spend too much time on the logical problem.
No, this is good. I wonder just real quick, so Plantinga talks about, how a best possible world is like, an incoherent concept or something. You can always add, I think he always says like an extra hula girl or something like that.
Oh,
He's like, "You could always add a."
this is the material on Anselm when he's assessing the
Yeah.
Lost Island objection
Right, right.
to Anselm.
And I wonder if that does that play into the response at all where, God would have to make, the world with the least amount of evil or anything like that? Or is this just, no, all we need to show is that there's one possible world where God exists with evil. We don't have to go in for, and God would have to make a best world or anything like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, in class, I have a little handout where I talked about what Plantinga calls Leibniz's lapse, right? Um, And Leibniz and Mackey both have this kind of like assumption in common that God could have created just any possible world.
Mhm.
Leibniz uses that assumption to argue from, well, there is a best possible world, and then saying, well, of course, God then would, has the ability to create it. So therefore, like this world, despite its evil, just is the best of all possible worlds. So Leibniz is
Right.
is arguing on behalf of the angels, as it were. Whereas Mackey, he also holds to this view that God could create just any possible world, right? But then
Mhm.
he thinks it's just obvious that the best possible world has no evil in it. So he
Yeah.
deduces, therefore, this world, our actual world, right, just can't be the best possible world. And so it couldn't have been created by God. If God has the attributes you Christians say, he would have created a better world. Now,
Right.
Plantinga mainly sets his sights on that premise about what omnipotence could do. And, and,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like the bizarreness of his claim that God could remain omnipotent, and yet there's possible worlds that he can't actualize. It's not
Right.
because he actually has something, any kind of weakness. It's just because there are these truths about how people use their free will. But you are right that in addition to making that move, he also expresses some kind of skepticism that there really could be a best of all possible worlds. I don't think just saying that gets you out of the logical problem
Okay.
because, okay, maybe for any world you think of, you can always think of a better. Right. But Mackey's going to say God should have selected among, the range of worlds that have no evil in them. Right.
Ah,
That kind of
yeah.
thing, or at least a world with less evil or something like, something like that. So I don't think
Yeah.
like the bare claim, hey, there is no best possible world gets you out of it. Cause even like a Molinist like Plantinga would, I think would think there's at least like I don't know, a best of all feasible worlds or a best
Okay.
among a kind of like I don't know, range of feasible worlds. And so I have to think about it a bit more to
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
No, that's helpful.
yeah.
So you've also written a book on the problem of evil, which is really good, and it's written, I would say at a popular level, which the task is insane. That like there's so much deep philosophical stuff, but you pitch it at a level where like a really well educated high schooler or undergrad student could understand it.
Mhm.
And I can't remember in the book if you take up the distinction between a defense and a theodicy. So maybe I can just random question for you. Do you like Plantinga's distinction between giving a defense and giving a theodicy?
Yes, but this, at least some people think this is, how can I put it? For them, this is non-standard usage of key terms. This is Swinburne's view.
Oh,
Swinburne
okay.
thinks that um, Plantinga's understanding of defense, the way he uses it, is just misleading. And again, I have a handout where I talk about the distinction between undercutting and rebutting defeaters, which
Uh-huh.
you might sometimes that maps on to the distinction between defense and theodicy, but actually it doesn't because Plantinga's defense. See, so a theodicy is saying like, here's what God's reason is for putting evil, or here's what
Mhm.
God's likely reason is. That it comes prepackaged with a kind of plausibility, right? There's at least some kind
Yeah.
of likelihood, right? On this is God's real explanation for at least a important range of significant pain and suffering in the world. Um,
Right.
Whereas defense just gives a purely, possible reason, right? It's logically possible, but there doesn't have to be any likelihood. And Plantinga is just saying to answer the logical problem in particular, all you need is a kind of defense, right?
Yeah.
But his defense then, even though he's only giving a possibility, namely transworld depravity. I mean, I guess I didn't define
Right.
that earlier, but that's what I was
Yeah.
describing.
Uh-huh.
Um, that defense, um, it can be used to disprove Mackey's claim about contradiction between God
Yeah.
and evil. Um, I I tend to, I sort of acknowledge there's a plurality in the discussion about theodicy and defense. I just make the distinction between undercutting defeaters and rebutting defeaters. To me, this is like
Okay.
the most important and clear distinction to make. And there's more consensus on what we mean by these terms, right? Again, an undercutting defeater simply looks at someone's argument and says, well, maybe your conclusion is true. Maybe it's false. I'm not going to like get into that. I'm just saying you didn't give a good argument. So skeptical
Yeah.
theism is like that. Skeptical
Mhm.
theism, as you find in Plantinga and maybe like in Bergman and Howard Snyder and a number of other authors, right, is a kind of undercutting defeater. Just say, well, he who affirms must prove. Your evidential argument from evil seems to assume something, that if God had a reason for permitting evil, that reason would be discernible by us. And since I just can't come up with it, it's likely God doesn't have a reason, right? They're committing themselves to
Yeah.
something. A skeptical theism is saying, well, I'm not quite sure you've borne the burden of proof
Right.
um, here. So that's an undercutting defeater. A rebutting defeater then um, sort of goes on the offensive and overturns the conclusion. So you say that there's no reason that God could have for preventing evil. I say unto you, there's loads of reasons. And then you roll up your sleeves and start talking about soul building and value of free will
Yeah.
and God, pain is God's megaphone, C.S. Lewis style. And I do combine both those approaches in the book. I guess your question was
Yeah.
about the little book, which is in
Yeah.
a series published by Christian Focus, the Big Ten. These books are meant to be handed to even unbelievers who have no familiarity with the Bible. Here's what a Christian would say. I don't claim to represent, all Christians, but I mean, here's what a Christian might say on some of these difficult topics.
Yeah.
So it's supposed to be accessible. But yeah, so maybe for the sake of time, and you can ask whatever follow-ups you want, but my slogan really in the book is that the way of theodicy is the way of the fool, whether
Mm.
you rule it in or out, and it's the way of the wise to know this. So the idea
Mm.
here is that two groups need to learn humility: Christians and unbelievers,
Okay.
non-Christians. Christians need to learn humility and not going around ruling in theodicy as God's
Yeah.
likely reason, right? I
Yeah.
think critics of theodicy are right that you could potentially increase the problem of evil in the world by being a Christian like that, who's going
Yeah.
around ruling in theodicy, right? But I think it would also be unwise to rule it out. I don't think unbelievers, or believers for that matter, know enough to say, I'm quite confident this couldn't have been, right, God's
Yeah.
reason, or that he doesn't have it. So I think it's the way of the wise to know that both these groups, right, can neither rule in nor rule out theodicy. And of course, you only have to say the second thing to sort of deal with a lot of the problem of evil, at least on the philosophical side, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
No,
so
that's really helpful. Well, so the ruling out against the non-believer. I mean, obviously, or maybe not super obvious, but skeptical theism does that and says, look, you'd have to you'd have to be God in order to know, or it's inscrutable. Uh, God's reasons are inscrutable to a finite being like us. You can pitch it in a lot of different ways. Is that what's doing the work to against the Christian who would say this is God's reason? Or maybe is there more like theology at play where you're saying like, look, dude, you don't know the mind of God. God is not like, is it skeptical theism that's doing the work against the Christian and the non-Christian concerning theodicy, or is there more at play, I guess?
right. Well, yeah. I mean, part of that. I mean, there's a number of sort of desiderata that are being satisfied in the book. And
Sure.
and I don't want to give the impression like skeptical theism is like all we can say, like
Right.
just shrug our
Right.
shoulders, right? I mean, that's one of the objections I try to deal with at the end of the book. It looks like a kind of giant cop out, right? Can't Christians do
Hmm.
better after 2,000 years or something? So um I do give a case that various theodicies, right, might have some kind of biblical sort of indication pointing in that direction, right? So
Yeah.
something like soul building or um, suffering is something that shapes us or gives us very valuable opportunities, that kind of thing. I think there's a number of passages, right, from Hebrews and First Peter and all the rest that are indicate that God does indeed use suffering in that way. Pain is God's megaphone, right? I think Luke 13, Jesus turns around the seeming assumption of his disciples. Oh, the Tower of Siloam fell on those people and killed them because they were worse sinners. It was just the judgment of
Right.
God. And Jesus says, I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you will likewise perish. He turns it around into like a warning for those who remain, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to declare this a judgment on those who perished, but it
Mm.
might be in the hands of God a warning to you who remain. And so he turns it into a call for repentance, right?
Yeah.
I do talk about, greater good theodicy, and there's the typical passages for that, whether it's narrative context, like the Job, Joseph, and Jesus narratives, or certain
Yeah.
general passages like Romans 11, Romans 8, that kind of thing. So, like, we're not like without an ability to say anything about what God might be up to, right?
Right.
But then the idea is, now that these are on the table, what is the case from the unbeliever, that these aren't God's reasons? They might say, well, um, because they don't cover this particular case of horrific evil, right? They might be able to cover
Hmm.
these cases over here, but not this particular case of horrific evil. And we might admit that and say, right, there are limitations. And I talk about the limitations in the book. But why think
Yeah.
the goods we know of are representative of all the goods there are? And that seems to
Right.
be an assumption made by the unbeliever when they make a plausible case that, look, there are cases of pain and suffering that aren't covered by your theodicy.
Hmm.
We might be able to say, right, but for all you know, and for all you can show, there are goods that God is aiming at, right? That you're not
Yeah.
aware of. And so I'm not gonna deny that a kind of skeptical theist approach doesn't underlie, right? Maybe even structure a lot of what I'm saying. But I
Yeah.
think that approach needs to be blended with sort of articulating specific theodicies,
Yeah.
right?
Amen. That's awesome.
Um,
I love.
so
I think
it's
you're
more
totally
helpful when
right
you
there.
put them together than when you divide them. But you definitely need to be humble in this matter of theodicy. You can handle theodicy in a way that you actually increase the amount of suffering in the world, because Nicholas Walter Short's book Lament for a Son, right, sort
Yeah.
of brings out like the pain that was caused him by even various well-meaning Christians who came to
Yeah.
him and declared various things, after the death of his son. So that's like an essential book that I assign to the
Yeah.
the student.
Like Job's unhelpful friends, right? Yeah.
Yes, right. See, I see all these themes, here. Like, clearly, God is aiming at great goods, right? The vindication of His own name, in the
Yeah.
face of Satan's accusations. But of course, He doesn't include Job into it. Meanwhile, his friends just go for a punishment theodicy, and God says at the
Yeah.
end, "Yeah, you guys didn't speak rightly of me the way Job did." So notice there's a number of things going on here. There is a kind of theological angle here in Job. God is aiming at
Mhm.
great goods by way of various um, pains and sufferings, either their actuality or possibility. But at the same time,
Yeah.
he's leaving created agents in the dark. So I find
Yeah.
both these sides of the issue that they're like slammed together with no apologies in passage after passage after passage. And I think that's just intensely significant.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I think that's actually a really good segue to the evidential problem,
Mm,
to Rowe's argument, and then just covering a couple. We don't have to go over all of
mhm.
Plantinga's replies. Again, I wish we had 15 hours, but there's so much to this book, which is really impressive that you could fit all that in there. But can you broach Rowe's evidential argument for us?
Right. So, in one way or another, so this is a kind of more modest alternative to Mackey's logical argument, which just claimed that, just one speck of evil in the world would decisively disprove God, right? It's not about
Hmm.
amount of evil or the horrific nature of evil. It's that there's any evil at all is supposed to constitute a decisive disproof of God. And a kind of consensus has emerged, not universal, a kind of consensus has emerged that, Plantinga sort of maybe disposed of that, right? And his way of
Hmm.
doing that in the mid 70s sort of, again, helped to put him on the map, right?
Yeah.
And gain him readers for his subsequent philosophy, particularly in the realm of epistemology and elsewhere. So the evidential argument is really that evil constitutes strong evidence against God's existence. It may not, strictly speaking, make God's existence impossible, but it makes it unlikely. Just as
Yeah.
if you were to go to Metropolis and move there, and people say, "Hey, this is a great place. Superman's here," and then you're wandering around Metropolis, and you see school buses filled with children going over bridges. You see, all of these buildings burning down, and people are like, "Where's Superman? Is he in the bar flicking peanuts at the mirror?" Or um, I guess
Yeah.
technically it's possible Superman lives in Metropolis, but it seems really unlikely, right? And so
Mhm.
that's the flavor of the evidential argument from evil. So you think of Rowe's article, William Rowe, the friendly atheist, from the fawn that burns to death in the forest fire, right after
Right.
suffering in agony for multiple days. And so Rowe is running through the typical theodicies, right? And he
Yeah.
realizes these can't easily apply to this case of animal suffering. It can't be like Bambi needs to suffer so that his character gets shaped, or that he responds favorably to the gospel, or has an opportunity to exercise his free will, right? And so
Yeah.
he picks this case of suffering because it seems to be particularly difficult for Christians to explain with the traditional theodicies. And it was a catalyst for animal suffering to be a more prominent part of the discussion and free
Right.
will studies. So then what do you do with this? What do you do with this argument that says it's just the profusion of evil in the world, the seemingly gratuitous nature of it, the horrific nature of some of it, right? That maybe like Marilyn Adams speaks
Yeah.
eloquently about, makes it really unlikely, right? So this is where I identify 5 different replies that Plantinga gives to that argument.
Mm.
And so, I mean, I don't know how much we can get into it, but so one reply is to sort of give up the ghost and say, yeah, you might have a good argument. Okay, you're right. Strictly speaking, if I just focus on evil, that makes the existence of God less likely than it would otherwise be. But then he
Right.
makes the fairly pedestrian point in a very humorous context, though, that that might not be all the evidence we have to adjudicate the question, right?
Yeah.
It might be that there's a lot of good pro-God arguments, right? Including
Mm.
arguments about how we need God to sort of make sense of our intuition that there's a way things ought to be, right? In the
Right.
first place,
Right.
which is sort of what's driving the problem of evil in the first place. Why are they so convinced there's a way things ought to be? That kind of
Mm.
thing. So this is what I mean. I think I say something like contextualizing the problem of evil within a larger body of evidence. So this is the Fique as a Frisian stuff, right?
Yeah.
Fique as a Frisian. This goes back to his Dutch um, sort of upbringing, right? And 9 out of 10 Frisians can't swim, right? They just don't swim. That seems pretty likely in that evidence that Fique can't swim. Right. Okay. Slam dunk. We have an evidential argument against Fique being able to swim. That's sort of like the evidential argument against God existing. But then
Yeah.
in Plantinga says, but maybe then we learn something new, a new piece of evidence. It's completely consistent with the old piece of evidence. I mean, it has to be for this to all be coherent. So we have a new
Yeah.
piece of evidence, and that is that Fique is a Frisian lifeguard, and 8 out of 10 Frisian lifeguards can swim, right? I
Right.
mean, I feel
Right.
bad for the people who are with the 20%, on the beach
I
who can't
know.
swim, right? If something happens.
Right.
Okay, but now with this
Right.
new piece of evidence, it's no longer unlikely that Feek can swim. Now it's very likely he can swim, right? And that's because
Yeah.
the likelihood and unlikelihood of a claim is assessed relative to the body of evidence data that you're considering.
Mm.
And so maybe that's how that is with the problem of evil. Interestingly enough, Swinburne takes the same view in his book on the existence of God. He's giving
Mm.
positive case for God, and then he sort of pauses and says, "Now, what about the problem of evil?" And his view is that God's existence definitely takes a hit from the problem of evil. The likelihood of God's existence, may very well go down because of this evil, but he doesn't
Yeah.
think it takes an insuperable hit. Um,
Yeah.
and so there's the pro God evidence, the variety of it, the profusion of it, all the rest sort of outweighs, what can be done with this anti-God evidence. And then I think maybe like religious experience comes in and wins the day at the end of the Bayesian argument.
Yeah.
It's the scales, which is all you need for his sort of Pascalian kind of basis for going down a religious path. But anyway, that's Swinburne. But so that's the first reply. Second reply is to adapt the free will defense. And I find that a lot of people miss that. And I think maybe
Yeah.
I might have missed that. And that is, people always think, oh, yeah, free will defense, that refutes Mackey and the logical problem of evil. Well, actually, if you go a little bit later in God, Freedom, and Evil, he appeals to a version of the free will defense to defeat the evidential argument. Because what he
Yeah.
says is that if you think that it's really unlikely that God exists, then you must think the following claim is very, very unlikely. And it's what I call the no better balance claim. It's
Mm.
something like, for all you know, like all the evil in the world is broadly moral evil. That means it's either brought about by human agents or by fallen angels abusing their free will, right? So
Right.
natural and moral evil both get explained or maybe collapsed on this view, right? And there was no better balance of broadly moral good as compared to broadly moral evil that was available to God to bring about. Well, what the advocate of the argument for evil has to say here is, well, no, there was a better options open to God, and so
Yeah.
given that this is the world we find ourselves in, it's really unlikely that God exists. And so Plantinga says, well, if you're committed to that inference, you're committed to the unlikelihood of there being no better balance. Now, how do you know that? How do you know that that claim is unlikely? The truth of that claim depends on what the counterfactuals are. For all you know,
Yeah.
there are these counterfactuals, and they go the way that this claim is saying there was no better balance. It's not like unbelievers have some cosmic book of the counterfactuals. They can like page through and go, oh, look, this is what God was faced with, right? They don't have
Right.
access to such
Right.
a book. So they actually can't make a case for the unlikelihood of that claim. But the evidential argument, is committed to that claim being unlikely. So
Yeah.
if I could lay it out, I would give the whole modus tollens structure to the whole thing. But
Sure.
I found it to be a very ingenious adaptation of the free will defense in a probabilistic context, right?
Yeah.
And so
Uh, uh,
it's often overlooked. Third reply is to
yeah.
critique the probability theory that evidential
Yeah.
arguers use, whether it's logical, objective, personalist probability. Please don't ask me to explain this any further. It's
Yeah.
quite
Yeah. Well,
technical
right.
essay. It gets reprinted in the Howard Snyder anthology and the evidential arguments from evil. The
Yeah.
fourth reply is going to be skeptical theism, right?
Mhm.
So again, if your hearers want to see this, go to ccel.org, look up Plantinga's book, Warranted Christian Belief, which is made available in its entirety for free at ccel.org. I think Plantinga was like behind like getting that. Read the last chapter, chapter 14.
Hmm.
That'd be a nice statement of, are God's reasons for evil more like St. Bernard's or more like Noceum's, right? There's an assumption
Yeah.
being made here. So I won't say anything further about that, but that's like the fourth reply. Fifth reply actually is surprising, and that is
Mhm.
the O Felix Culpa Theodicy. For so long, Plantinga had argued that the way of theodicy just is not very credible or plausible for Christians. He just very much was skittish about it, refrained from offering, theodicies, not quite sure it can be done. In fact, that's why I'm giving a defense and not a theodicy back in the 70s.
Right. Right.
Then you get, later on in the 2000s or whatever, he comes out with O Felix Culpa, like 2004 or something like that. And so he thinks he's hit upon an actual theodicy that is plausible, right? And it involves the adaptation of a traditionally Calvinistic doctrine known as supralapsarianism. Um, and so
Which is so wild.
which is about the
Yeah.
ordering of the decrees, and God's decree to commit the fall, vis-a-vis creation and redemptive ends. The bottom line is that God wants to create a top-notch world.
Mhm.
Forget about whether there is like a single best world, but God wants to
Right.
create a top-notch world. Number one, every world's going to have extraordinary value because God's going to be in it because God necessarily exists, if he exists at all.
Yeah.
Um, but number two, even within that realm, worlds that have incarnation and atonement are far more valuable than worlds that lack it. And then he makes the argument that if you're going to have incarnation and atonement, there's going to have to be sin.
Yeah.
And so there is a theodicy then for why God purposes to permit sin, as it were. And
Yeah.
it's going to be because God wants to bring about a top notch world. Lots of red flags might be raised in your mind, as they were with others when they read this essay, including Marilyn Adams, who replies to it. You can get all the gory details in the Michael Peterson anthology in the Palm of Evil, which is probably one of the
Yeah.
best anthologies available, I think, just for getting students into the topic. But that struck a lot of people as like, whoa, has Plantinga become a Calvinist? You know? Well, no, not technically. I think he's on record saying somewhere that like the 5 points are logically contradictory. So, just anything follows
Yeah.
contradiction or something. But he's deeply influenced, right, by the Reformed tradition. And so once again, he's deploying a kind of distinctively Reformed doctrine in the realm of more or less secular philosophy to make a
Yeah.
point. So that's the fifth and final reply to the evidential argument, the way of theodicy.
Yeah.
So
Which is it's so funny, to think about this. I don't know if you it might be said to be an obscure doctrine, this or a obscure debate between infra and supralapsarianism. It's kind of a word you throw out if you want to impress somebody maybe in systematic theology circles. And Plantinga just injects that into the popular conversation about God and evil. And I thought that was so wild that when someone showed me that essay, I was like, no way, I can't believe it.
yeah, there's a it's old now, but there's a Daniel Dennett like dictionary of philosophy or something, all these humorous definitions. And of course there's this
Yeah.
word to alvinize, which I think is a
Yeah.
takeoff on like galvanizing your hearers. Instead, it's to Alvinize your hearers. He Alvinized his hearers by refuting a logical problem of evil by talking about counterfactuals, or it's basically defined as like this really bizarre claim that's advanced in a serious context, right?
Yeah.
And so you find that, right? I mean, there's no consensus among the Reformed as to whether we should be superlapsarian or infralapsarian, but
Right.
I don't know. Maybe he's being sort of edgy there and
Right.
coming out on behalf of some version of superlapsarianism. Though, of course, it's coming out of Notre Dame, right? Roman Catholic kind of environment as well, right? The O Felix Culpa is from the Easter liturgy, right? I think I give the
Yeah.
Latin in the book, and so
Mhm.
this goes all the way back to perhaps like Irenaeus, right? So this
Mhm.
kind of thinking is not like sprung fully formed from the head of the Reformed scholastics or
Right.
Puritan. There's a thinking of Adam's fall being a kind of happy fault. You have to be very careful, of course, how you describe this, but
Yeah.
anyway, it's an interesting essay.
Yeah. You can feel free to punt on this one, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on whether or not the O Felix Culpa is does that run afoul of your suggestion that Christians should, not be so quick to rule in
Yeah.
theodicies?
Yeah. Yeah, you've caught me at a bit of a loss because I mean I haven't like reviewed the actual text of it
Sure.
recently, this essay, right? It's always important
Yeah.
to go off of not like, well, I think I remember,
Yeah, yeah, sorry
possibly,
about
and
that.
then the
Right.
next moment the guy's swinging from a noose, right? Because you just convicted him of some awful thing, and actually this was like a kangaroo court, and you
Right.
attributed him views that he didn't have about burden of proof and all the rest.
Yeah.
That would be awful.
Right.
I'm doing the Fallen Weevil class this term for the master's
Mm.
students, and I know I'm
Awesome.
going to be getting to this essay a little bit later. And there's
Yeah.
a reply, possibly from Kevin Diller and some others. So I think maybe he conditionalizes, right? Like, given
Yeah.
the body of Christian theology, given what we know from the scriptures, it seems it seems really likely that this is like a very plausible theodicy, given the
Yeah.
value that we learn from those sources about incarnation and about atonement. I mean, he has some very eloquent passages of like why would God put his son through such suffering, right? Unless there
Yeah.
was something of extraordinary value, right, at stake, right? And he gets a lot of lessons from this as well. Um, so it's different than from like transworld depravity or something, which is like this bare logical possibility.
Right.
There's nothing that like Christian theology speaks in favor of transworld depravity. He has a joke that, its relation to total depravity is left as an exercise for the reader to work out. But he's
Yeah.
not claiming transworld depravity comes from the Christian tradition. It's just a
Right.
kind of gerrymandering. He likes to do this.
Mm.
Planning is all about I can beat you with one hand tied behind my back, right? So
Right.
a bizarre possibility I thought of the other day refutes you. Like um, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
your argument's like a house of cards. Let's make it stronger. Oh, I'm going to kick it over anyway, right? I mean, that's his like
Right.
rhetorical style, which has left its mark on a number of people. But the Orpheus Culpa, I mean, he seems to be like as serious as a heart attack. That this is
Yeah.
arises quite naturally from the Christian tradition, and as Christians, we are committed to the value of incarnation and atonement playing some role in God's plan for the world and what kind of evil God is willing to put up with. I
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
spirit of that, right? I like the spirit of being guided by what God takes seriously. But I think, of course, you have to add a healthy dose of fallibility, right? And
Yeah.
our ability to
Yeah.
discern, these things. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I really like the O Felix Culpa, and it's probably because I came into philosophy through, Van Til and through Frame, and Frame calls it, I think, like, Christocentric, greater good theodicy, and pointing to the
Mm,
cross. Why is there evil in the world? Well, ultimately, like, God is most glorified on the cross and without sin. It's very similar, insofar as I'm getting Dr. Frame right, to the O Felix Culpa. And I also take your advice really seriously and, like, look up to you. Like, for me personally, I'm trying to, like, walk the line of how do I say this in a way that's still God honoring? I don't want to say this is exactly what God told me, that this is why He allowed evil, but giving like a plausible story to say, hey, look, this seems like a a plausible Christian response that God, a world with evil, is a better world than a world without evil because we get to have more revelation of God. We get to see that He is the type of God who would incarnate and atone for sins. And in a world where you didn't have that, you wouldn't know God as Redeemer, Savior, all the things that are demonstrated on the cross. What I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, part of the insight is, part of what makes heaven to be heaven is that it was preceded by a veil of tears,
Yeah,
and it is populated by those who have been redeemed from their sin, right? You can get this just from the songs that are being sung in the book of Revelation, right? Apart from the fall, I mean, whole realms of God's character would be completely unrevealed to us in terms of his compassion and his forgiveness and willing to provide atonement and undergo suffering on our behalf and that kind of thing, right? We wouldn't have an inkling of that. And I agree that intuitions divide. I think Kevin Diller just says, nope, I don't have the intuition that we need any of that for just a good relationship with God. Just no
right.
fall and we're good to go. We have
Hmm.
unbroken communion with God, and that's it, right? And I mean, I don't quite know more what to say to that, other than, I mean, we may have to take some of our cues from how God has actually governed His universe,
Yeah,
and then reflect a bit on Jesus as the lamb slain from before the foundation of the world, right? So the cross just can't be an afterthought, that kind of thing. God knew what He was
yeah,
doing when He was planning the world. There certainly seems to be like prophecy in the Old Testament. This is like something that is planned, and I agree at one level. This idea of planned evil, right, strikes many people, particularly secularists, but also many sincere Christians, as just a non-starter, right?
right,
It's just
right.
entirely offensive. You're writing yourself out of the discussion, right? But I guess I take a few cues from Flanagan here, and then I just sort of want to dig in my heels and just say, well, wait a minute. I do think that there are specifics in divine revelation, and
Yeah,
so God does seem to have a kind of plan that includes this. There might
yeah,
we might not have all the clarity we want. Thus, the debate between infras and supras and all the rest.
yeah, right.
Um, but the idea that God was like rolling the dice when He created the universe. He didn't create the universe with some kind of plan in mind that involved things. I mean, I totally understand, like, like maybe like an open theist view, right?
Yeah,
Um,
right.
Open theism actually is like a robust alternative for me. It's one that's extremely
Oh, wow.
fascinating to me. Whereas other alternatives are not that interesting to me, including
Sure.
Arminianism and Molinism. They don't
Yeah,
they don't seem to really provide a big alternative to, maybe what many call the Calvinistic Reformed tradition. I mean, Arminius was
yeah,
a Reformed theologian, so there's no
right.
cities
Totally.
here. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah, so I just would sort of just hold my ground and say, I'm sorry, but the idea that God aims at great goods by way of great sufferings and leave created people in the dark, I just see that shaping so many biblical narratives that I would
yeah,
be shocked if, as a matter of fact, this isn't mysteriously included in God's plan. So yeah, I guess I'm saying I think Plantinga's on the right track here, but I
awesome.
understand those who either think they have a principled rational argument against it or just it's intrinsically offensive to them. But I would just continue the conversation, right?
Right,
It's
right. Yeah, you don't
like
solve it all with
it's
one
not like
paper.
I labeled you as, you don't like this, so I guess we can't talk. I mean,
Right, right.
no, I mean, you're a human being created in the image of God, right? I mean, God's called me to maybe influence you for good in the best ways I know how. I think that means not cutting off conversations with you.
Right.
Um, so,
So
um,
good.
so there you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, well, thanks, Dr. Welty. This has been so awesome. We've only covered, one chapter. I wanted to ask one last question here, maybe kind of a bonus. It doesn't really follow a ton from the evil,
Okay.
but you have this really great characterization on page 68, where you say it's important to clarify the nature of the support given to the claim that God
Uh,
exists, by the various arguments endorsed by Plantinga, and you also say that we can distinguish at least four possible kinds or degrees of support, and then you list different people with those. Maybe I could read them if you want, or I could just let you, take a whack at it yourself.
Oh, no, you can read. I mean, I have the book over there. I mean, you can read it. I
Yeah,
think
let me just read them
there
because
was a
I really
reason why
like
I
it.
laid it out that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's this claim God exists, and then, there's different ways that you can support it. The first one, you say necessarily God must exist, and the contrary is simply impossible because God's existence is the very precondition of intelligibility, meaning, and predication. And this is Van Til's transcendental argument. So this is the top layer.
Hmm.
Then going down a step is God's certainly exists because his existence deductively follows from undoubtable premises. That's Thomas Aquinas's classic natural theology. Then taking a degree less, God very likely exists because inductive argument shows that he is the best explanation for a wide range of empirical data, and that's Swinburne, his probabilistic natural theology. And then the lowest tier is there is good reason to believe that God exists, at least more reason than we had before considering a particular theistic argument. And I believe that's where you put Plantinga, right?
Yeah, yeah. I definitely wanted to locate him right on this kind of spectrum, particularly because of the publisher of the book, P&R, and maybe likely readers of the book. Right. Hopefully, it's beyond the reform camp. Maybe that's
Sure.
more interested on average in P&R books than others. Right. I mean, I'm writing it for multiple groups of people that we could talk about in a moment.
Yeah.
But, yeah, so I have this list because many of those who read the book, right, well, where is this located, like with Cornelius Van Til and all the rest? And I sort of
Yeah.
wanted to introduce readers to, there's a whole spectrum of what's being done in
Yeah.
terms of, let's say, arguments for theism or Christian apologetics. And you can't really do a chapter on Plantinga's method, which is what that chapter is, I think, is what you're
Yeah.
talking about, unless you locate him. So I wanted to just be absolutely clear. Plantinga isn't doing that. He's not doing a transcendental argument for God's existence. There's stuff he does that is sort of in the spirit of Van Til, right?
Sure.
This kind of naturalism defeated argument that he has against evolutionary naturalism, or some of the arguments I believe they're in chapter 9 of Where the Conflict Really Lies, when he's saying there's a lot of like presuppositions in science that would be rooted in like poisonous soil if it's secular soil, but seem to be in
Right.
very healthy soil if it's theological soil. In fact, various things we believe about the existence of God, his attributes are being made in the image of God, helps to account for why these are the right things to believe at the foundations of science. And as a matter of fact, have been at the foundation of science. And so he gives a kind of what Van Tillians might hear as theological preconditions for knowledge and
Yeah.
science. It's not really
Right.
anything all that strong, but it's a kind of in the spirit of it, right?
Mhm.
So right there's like that level. Then of course deductive natural theology, Aquinas's five ways, that kind of thing. Ed Facer, right?
Yeah.
Has
Right.
his book on the five proofs, and he actually relies on my refers to dissertation giving the Augustinian proof. I was very happy that he gave me the time of day, given his various work. But right, there's a whole body of work, sort of more classically oriented, deductive. Then there's Swinburne, right? So after graduating Westminster, I guess I could say I was sort of pushed more in a more like natural theology direction inductively, just sort of considering his approach, his cumulative case approach. I thought that there was
Yeah.
an awful lot to it, right? Maybe I'm viewed as apostate in the eyes of maybe some classmates at Westminster. I mean, you just got to let the chips
Totally.
fall where they may.
Right.
I found my views on apologetics broadening at Oxford, but I also found that my theology, for whatever reason, was becoming um, even more locked down. I think it speaks not that it wasn't before, but I think being in
Sure.
the modern doctrine seminar, being surrounded by particularly just Protestant liberals and hearing them argue, I, I just
Pushed you
I
back
just
deeper
found
in.
I found my faith being all the more confirmed for whatever reason.
Wow.
But Swinburne
Yeah.
pushed me in that sort of direction. I
Yeah.
think my first essay I wrote for him, I accused all his whole body of work just totally circular. and you're a closet ventilator, you just don't know it, you know? And he was like, what? You know, and,
That's
no,
so
my system is more like a house of cards. And I was like, that's not a really great metaphor there. Um, and well, the it's this, props of this, props of this, and that kind of thing. And so we
yeah,
went back and forth on that. But yeah, so then there's Plantinga, and Plantinga, of course, doesn't think you can give this sort of cumulative case natural theology that establishes the likelihood of God the way Swinburne does. But he does think that like individual arguments can be what he calls helps to faith, a
yeah,
phrase that he gets from Calvin. Um, so you might want to take a look at a book called The Plantinga Project, which is a
yeah.
400-page expansion of Plantinga's 24 or so arguments for the existence of God. This is edited by Jerry Walls, who was one of Plantinga's students, and then
Mm.
Trent, is it Doherty, Doctor
Doherty. Yeah,
Doherty, yeah.
Doherty.
And just a fabulous book. And again, it's surprising because it shows how Plantinga has stimulated much discussion in natural theology.
Mm.
The word on the street is supposed to be that Plantinga, as a reformed epistemologist, has no place for it.
Right.
But as a matter of fact, he does have a place for individual arguments, making for us, in a kind of person variable sense, God's existence more likely than it was before I encountered this argument.
Right.
And so, of course, the Van Helians, the Thomists, maybe even the Swinburnians are going to be looking down and going, "Yep, that's why Plantinga should be on the fourth tier of the totem pole."
That's
I'm
right.
not sure what that is doing.
Yeah,
We have a better Christian witness than that. But Plantinga's going to say, "Well, I mean, philosophy is very integrated, right? I mean, I have
yeah,
commitments elsewhere that preclude me maybe from taking your more majestic projects."
yeah,
But I don't know, Mao Zedong, let a thousand flowers bloom.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well, that's why I like that distinction that we broached earlier because I think even analyzing that and saying, well, who are their audiences? That might help explain, the commitments or the types of arguments that are used. Um, I love Van Til. I've read a lot of Van Til, but
mm,
he's primarily speaking to his like master students.
mm.
And so if he was speaking to secular philosophers, they might be different, and maybe not. I don't want to psychologize the guy too much, but the audience matters, and so yeah, I think we need to keep that in mind as well. But Dr. Welty, I just wanted to find out, like, where do you find yourself on this descending list?
Yeah, whenever students ask me that question, I always say, "Oh, my views don't matter. Let's get back to our readings now."
Yeah,
I think because though, in the context, there can be a kind of mini tribalism that emerges within any Christian institution, right? Where,
100%, 100%.
oh, you're Kleinian, you're Freemian, you're
Yeah, man.
triple line. This won't make any sense to non-Westminster, uh,
Sure.
uh, that
Happens a lot at
kind of thing.
Westminster. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's like really important, right? Where does the professor land? As if like my declaration should have any epistemological weight whatsoever, right? Like,
Sure. Sure.
right? Again, philosophy comes down to the
Well,
arguments.
yeah.
Um,
But evidence of evidence might be evidence, for
yeah,
internalists
I'm
there.
I'm
So
entirely happy, and I think it's quite consistent with my theology to have great hope for all four tiers, right? I always
okay.
say this to my students, particularly those who are interested in like doctoral studies, but like at any level. I mean, we have a PhD program that I teach in here as well as being the program coordinator for the MA and philosophy of religion. But I always say, hey, you've read some things in Van Til. You think that the transcendental argument is like worthy of development and representation, right, in our modern day and sharpening by way of contemporary sources. That sounds like a great idea, right? I mean,
Mm, yeah,
it's in Kant
that's
for a
cool.
reason, right? And Van Til sort of adapted that mode for a reason. He thought it really helped remind us of fundamental issues where God's at the center.
Yeah.
That's not to say that I've ever seen it fleshed out,
I
right?
know.
So
Yeah.
that it actually like
Tricky.
shows, right, why God must be a trinity instead of a quaternity or, whatever, right? Or these 66 books and not the Apocrypha, are
Yeah.
the precondition of intelligibility, right? I mean, maybe
That's
you can
hard.
lay that
Tall
out. And I,
task.
I don't want to border a caricature, but I mean, but
Sure.
I'm there's nothing in me that rules out that project in principle, right? So
Okay.
I would be
Yeah.
quite happy, right, for it to be actually developed. Van Til sort of bequeathed to the next generation a kind of framework, a kind of skeletal structure.
Right.
I think
Right.
Pang points out he sort of expected the next generation to fill this in, right? I don't know how
Yeah.
well it was. I'm quite happy with, some of the arguments that Ed Fazer, presents in the Five Proofs, book, sort of more in the spirit of deductive natural theology, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I could go down the list, right?
Sure. Right.
And
Yeah.
say I'm happy. So, I mean, true confession time. So I used to be more like what Frame calls a movement Vantillian,
Okay.
which was that any sort of move from the master inevitably involves compromise. And then and then Frame, of course, shared his book manuscript. Both Frame and Bonson wrote a big book on Van Til and a little book on Van Til, right? Frame's
Yep.
big book on Van Til is Cornelius Van Til, an analysis of his thought, right? And chapter 15 on antithesis is worth the price of the whole book. And there,
Totally.
I think he brings out how possibly Van Til may have exaggerated this antithesis, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so for Frame, that's a kind of backdoor to bring back in some of the more classical evidential modes of argument. Um, so I'm pretty Framian, right,
Yeah.
on this point of view. Um, but I don't know. I mean, that opens up a lot more things for me. So I still
Sure.
have like the theology basically that Ventil has, but I no longer hold to the alleged methodological implications from that theology. So the
Sure.
idea in Ventil is supposed to be if you hold to total depravity, if you hold the absolute sovereignty of God, if you hold to the absolute authority of God's word, maybe there's a couple other distinctives, then of course you will only use transcendental argumentation and you will never use classical or evidential argumentation. I'm
Right.
completely on board with all of those distinctives, but I no longer see them having the kind of like apologetical straitjacket kind of
Sure.
implications, right?
Mhm.
Um, that's cold comfort for those who think otherwise, and they wouldn't like me saluting the theology and then giving the Heisman to the methodology. And again, I'm happy with the methodology. I just don't like limiting Christian apologetics. It's a
Yeah.
blade on the Swiss Army knife of Christian apologetics, transcendental argument.
Yeah.
But I do think that I can incorporate it into a larger vision that's being worked out by
Yeah.
people in your neck of the woods in
Sure.
Florida or whatever.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, I seriously appreciate it, and there's a lot of folks like I'm on that same trajectory with you. Uh, I have tried to work out transcendental arguments, and I have one that I'm working on from Donald Davidson, and James Anderson's been helping like retool stuff and slapping stuff
Mm,
down. But when you go to actually try and make one, it's really tough to like establish the impossibility of a contrary type stuff. It's just hard. So I appreciate your words. I appreciate the broad camp
mm,
notions as well as holding firmly to the theology because that sometimes that
mm,
goes when people do this. So yeah, just wanted to say as we're closing up here, like
mm,
just a thank you. There's a lot of us who look to people like you and
mm.
Anderson and some others and just say like there's guys doing it in the same mode that we want to do it with the same theology that we want to continue to hold on to. So yeah, just a thank you from a lot of us.
Yeah, well, no problem. Again, I told you before you started recording, I mean, I don't think there's anything like intrinsically evil about social media and podcasts and all the rest, but I don't know, I feel like if not that I'm Aquinas, but I mean, if Aquinas had access to email, I'm not sure we would have like the summas and all the commentaries, and things like
Right.
that. I mean, you
Yeah.
sort of have to, I don't know, sequester yourself away, right? I mean,
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
making of many podcasts, there is no end, and much
That's
videoing
right.
wearies the body. And I find on social media that there's just a particular way of presenting people that, leaves me very discouraged, right? People always put their
Yeah.
best foot forward and I'm always reading, you ought to be this, you ought to be that. The one thing in the Christian life is this. Here's this one thing you cannot miss. Yeah, well, when you read that 20 times a day, apparently there's 20 things I cannot miss. And pretty
I
soon,
know.
I'm like an utter failure. And I
Yeah.
just had to make a decision, which had nothing to do with like the morality of it, but the practicality of it. So it might be though. I mean, if your viewers get a lot out of this podcast, they want more. I mean, I'd be happy to come on again. I mean,
Okay.
I don't
Awesome.
know, do more edgy issues. My two theological objections to Molinism and my three philosophical objections.
Yeah.
You know, um,
Bullet Bill would be a good
Whatever.
one. I know. Yeah.
Wow.
Right. All right. Well, you guys heard it, folks. So let us know in the comments that you want to have him back. Maybe we can convince him.
Molinists are our
Uh.
allies, though. They are our
Yeah.
allies in defending the
Okay.
full omniscience of God.
Okay, there we go. That's
And in
awesome. Yeah,
many much else besides. Okay.
yeah. Well, thanks, Dr. Welty. This has been fantastic. Folks, go ahead and grab the book. It's Plantinga, Alvin Plantinga, in the Great Thinkers series
Uh,
for Presbyterian and
yeah.
Reformed.
See, there it is.
Um,
Yeah.
there we go.
Two
And
for
I'll
one.
leave a link in the description. That's right. All right, folks, that's going to have to do it. This has been Parker's Pensées. And as always, all glory to God.